The basic geometry of a canoe's hull. When I go paddling, I have the privilege to sit with another person on the surface of water. It's a plane that quietly, or sometimes not so quietly, separates two distinct worlds. Reflecting, I often ask myself, what underlies the beauty that I see before me? The following, which I'll share here with you, will only touch the surface, but offers you my perspective on the basic geometry that underlies a canoe's hull. I offer it in the spirit of conversation because when we share things with other people, we not only tend to learn something new about our own topic, but about ourselves as well. In that vein, I hope you too, if you have comments or questions, that you'll leave your thoughts here below, and from now on we'll consider this a tandem relationship. Because after all, this is a video about canoes, and I think that's how things about canoes needs to be. Recently, I had the opportunity to visit the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. It's designed by the great architect named Louis Kahn, and the docent at the museum described the unique roof structure to be comprised of cycloid arches. Though not the same, they bore a cunning resemblance to the cross-section of a canoe's hull. In the moment, my mind ran tangent, and I wished I were out paddling. The arches, they were comfortable and quiet. I wondered what it was about them that held my attention. Was it my familiarity with such forms, having played with spirographs as a youth, or was it something more innate? While I'm amazed at the places a canoe can take me, perhaps the greater part of my appreciation lies with the simple and functional form that is the canoe itself. A thin shell designed to carefully open a small opportunity in nature, creating a momentary place for paddlers to enter and be, and then quietly close the door behind them as they leave. Architecture has dealt with openings in their passages for ages. The very practice bears the name arch, a method discovered to support loads overhead. While I'd love to continue with the arches of the Kimball and the world above, it is here I will set the cycloid arch aside for another time and turn my attention to the world below in pursuit of a paddler's geometry. Even though I'm now talking of what is beneath, I'm still going to use an arch as a method to carry the buoyant forces pushing up on my canoe. There are two types of arches that I think are worth noting: the three-centered arch and the four-centered arch. The three-centered arch is informed by three radii, one at the middle and one at each side. Similarly, the four-centered arch is informed by four radii, two at the middle and one at each side. For anyone who has been around canoes for a time, they will most certainly have heard the term shallow arch to describe the bottom shape of certain canoe hulls. Some would likewise be familiar with the term shallow V, a form iconic of Mad River canoes. With the drawings inverted, I can see that a three-centered arch forms a paddler's shallow arch, and the four-centered a shallow V. From here on, I will run with the three-centered arch as my prime example. It seems likely that whatever ideas I discover with the three-centered arch, I can transfer similar thinking to the four-centered without too much trouble. Also, since I'm exploring the shape of a canoe hull specifically, I will keep the arch symmetrical about its center. This means the two smaller circles will share the same radius. If you're confused how what we're seeing is part of a canoe, adding the stems and gunwale to the drawing helped me to see that I'm looking at the transverse section. This is the shape that I would see if I cut a canoe in half across the carrying yoke. The transverse section can be considered in three main parts: the bottom, the chine, and the side. A chine is simply a change in the angle of the hull. In this case, it's the transition from the bottom to the side. Following the geometry of the arch, I can also see how shortening or extending the chine can add flare or tumble home to the hull. Flare tends to keep a boat drier and more stable, while tumble home eases a paddler's reach to the water. Similarly, changing the center radius of the arch flattens or enhances the curve of the bottom. A very large radius begins to create a flat bottom, while a small radius creates a round. Very generally speaking, a flat bottom is more stable but less nimble, while a more round bottom is less stable but more nimble. It's at this point where things become very interesting to me. This is the point in the magic trick where I say, hold up, did I see that right? Because here I move on to the longitudinal section. And no, I haven't forgot to advance the image. This is the longitudinal section. It too can be considered using a three-centered arch. Having increased the center radius by a considerable amount, it now feels more like I'm looking at a canoe that's cut down its length. Showing the gunwale helps me to visualize that I'm now looking at the side profile of a canoe rather than at the front. Just as in the transverse section I had identified 3 parts of geometry, here too I have identified the very same 3 parts, but will name them slightly different. The bottom, or the keel line, the lower stem, and the upper stem. In like fashion to the chines, shortening or extending the lower stems can give the bow or stern a flare or tumble home shape. While there are, I'm sure, other terms I could use for specific bow shapes, I will continue to use these just to keep things simple for me. Changing the length of the center radius informs the bottom of the boat, making it more flat by increasing the radius or more curved by decreasing the radius. The overall height of the curvature is called rocker. Generally speaking, a hull that is more flat front to back will likely track better and have a shallower draft, while a boat with rocker, which is more curved front to back, will be more maneuverable but have a slightly deeper draft. Draft is simply how deep a boat runs in the water and should not be confused with the rocker dimension. Having considered both the longitudinal and transverse sections, I now want to move on to the top rim of the boat and consider the curves that make up the gunwales. Here, the 3-centered arch is no longer a good fit. Instead, I will utilize spline curves. While these are a digital version, creating long, complex curves in boat building has long been accomplished using flexible wood splines to create naturally smooth curves drawn through a collection of points. This new curve is unique to the others I've looked at before now because this curve is 3-dimensional instead of 2. This curve has length, width, and depth. This means that I need 2 viewpoints to describe it, a top view and a side view. The curvature in the top view informs the fullness of the boat. A fuller boat spreads buoyant forces out toward its ends, sacrificing speed, allowing it to bob in waves and remain on top of rough water. A lively ride, but a good fit for whitewater canoes. A less full boat streamlines its bow and stern, localizing its buoyant forces toward the middle of the hull. This attribute is common in racing and flatwater boats, like many popular models from Winona. When the boat strikes a small wave, the lack of volume at the bow allows the bow to penetrate the wave instead of climb the wave, offering a smoother and faster ride where stems remain close to the water's surface and maintain good tracking. The curvature of the gunwale in the side view, or the shear line, informs the dryness of the boat, establishing the height of shear over the length of the boat. Shear is any additional height added to the sides of a hull to accommodate wave height. More is necessary at the front since that is where the boat is colliding with and parting waves. If waves are large enough and the shear minimal, water will crash over into the front of a canoe, swamping the boat. A design sacrifice here is that too much shear can act as a small sail, making a boat difficult to control on a windy day. In review, I've now identified and considered 3 major curves and the parameters that define them, which I can use to create a canoe hull: a transverse section, a longitudinal section, and the gunwale curve. To close my thoughts on canoe hull geometry, I will mention that I have neglected to talk about select foundational elements. Since my focus has been on the geometry or the shape of a canoe hull only, and not on the actual physics of the structure, I have not mentioned thwarts, decks, or gunwales and what role they play. I briefly mention them now only to recognize their important function in stabilizing the hull geometry I spoke of. Think of the hull like a hard-shell taco. Until it's full of fixings to hold the sides apart, the taco is delicate and is more likely to collapse when held in the hand and squeezed. The thwarts and decks fix or hold the distance between the gunwales. Sometimes they act in tension, other times in compression, but at all times they hold the frame of a canoe's gunwales constant, like footings buried beneath a building, pinning the base of its columns together and stabilizing the building's structural geometry. I hope the information I have shared here has been informative, even if pieces of it fail to be perfectly accurate. Through this personal exploration, I now feel I have gained more understanding of that which underlies the beauty of a canoe hull, and I hope you have benefited from it too. If you enjoy this content, I encourage you to like this video and subscribe if you wish. If you have questions or observations, please become a part of the conversation and leave a comment with your thoughts. I close the waters behind us with 2 quotes from Louis Kahn. His thoughts, while in reference to buildings, speak in tandem to the beauty of a canoe, simple and functional. I don't know if he himself ever experienced a canoe, but his words make me think he certainly would have appreciated one.